Good evening. I'm Crevasse Advocate reporter Jada Crinning, and co-moderating with me tonight is publisher Steve Schultz. Welcome to tonight's CitySpeak Forum. CitySpeaks are presented by the Crevasse Advocate, which offers daily news online and, in non-pandemic times, a twice-monthly deep dive print publication, along with live forums and storytelling nights. CitySpeaks are co-presented by City Club of Corvallis, a volunteer-run nonprofit organization that seeks to present a diversity of viewpoints and constructive dialogue. Tonight, with the smoke cleared, we look at wildfires, the trends and drivers behind those trends, forest management strategies, OSU's fire extension program, and some common misunderstandings and controversies regarding fire and forest management. Our panel includes Corvallis Fire Chief Ken McCarthy, John Bailey, a professor of silviculture and fire management in OSU's College of Forestry, and Daniel Lavelle, a professor in OSU's College of Forestry and a faculty member of OSU's fire extension program. Steve?
Thank you, Jada. Next month, on the 10th, CitySpeak will get a preview of Oregon's 2021 legislative season from Representative Dan Rayfield, and we get a snapshot of the COVID-19 pandemic in Benton County from local health officials and experts. On the 17th next month, we'll host our annual look at homelessness locally. Folks, we want to thank Peak Sports and the First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op for their support of these forums. However, we could not present these forums without financial support from viewers like you. It costs $5 or $10 a month to subscribe to The Advocate. We, of course, encourage you to do that. Folks, you're supporting a rare bird when you do that. There is not much in the way of locally run and locally owned media in this country anymore. Corvallis, that is all we do. So that is what you would be supporting, along with forums like these. Jada.
Thanks, Steve. In a few minutes, we'll turn to audience questions. To ask a question while we're live, viewers can comment on the event slide post on our Facebook page, The Corvallis Advocate, or email us at cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. Again, that's cityspeak@corvallisadvocate.com. For now, we'll start with questions from our editorial board. Fire Chief McCarthy has a county meeting at 7, so we'll start with him. Chief McCarthy, what wildfire impacts and risks can we expect as Benton County cities continue to grow, pushing into the borders of forest and grasslands?
Sure, it's a great question. Obviously, the trend nationwide, as well as Corvallis, is moving out of the core of downtown areas and more into the suburbs. People are wanting more property, more trees, more wildlife, and continue to go further and further out into the rural areas. There's lots of challenges that come with that. The tax basis for a paid fire department is basically a system based on core, and there goes my lights, sorry. But anyhow, that's what happens when you're in a room where your lights turn off. They're based on a core system of a high tax base in a relatively low or high density area that allows them to provide paid coverage. So the further you go out, you have volunteer departments that have to respond from home. How fast and the right type of weather that a fire can take off and run is greatly influenced in the first few minutes. So that's always going to be a challenge. Water supply, the further you go out, the less hydrants, the less city systems you have, and you're having to shuttle water in. You usually get into hills and topography that increase fire spread. So absolutely, the challenge gets greater the further you go away from core services. I would say probably the best thing as you get into that is to work on plans and preparation for a fire where we may not be there for a little bit of time. So multiple evacuation routes, preparing your home, defensible space, those type of items.
Great. And in terms of those kinds of risks and impacts, is there anything that urban planning and city planning can do to mitigate those kinds of risks?
Well, the fire prevention has come a long ways since the 1970s. 1973, with the publication of America Burning, was the beginning of the modern fire code. What you see is much more flame-resistant type of materials and those type of safety items. but there's still a huge burden on the homeowners to prepare for that. So again, defensible space, keeping an area around your house clear, not having the trees right up against your house, not putting the burn piles or the wood piles under your deck, and cleaning out your gutters before the burn season. All it takes is, if you've got a fireproof roof, but needles in your gutters, is to get those needles going, and it will get up and under the roof. So it's just knowing what the preparation is that you should be doing for it. Although code helps, in and of itself, it will not be the answer.
Yeah, you touched on this a little bit. This was actually my next question, was just what individual homeowners, especially in high risk areas, can kind of do to mitigate those risks. Is there anything that you didn't touch on just now that?
Yeah, a few things. You should have thought about it ahead of time, have a to-go bag, so that you're not thinking at the time of the incident, what do I want to bring? You know, kind of pre-plan that. Have your family have a meeting place outside the house so you know that everybody is there. No more than one egress and access and egress route. So if you always drive the same way home, drive the roads in other directions just to see where they go. How do I get out of here? What are my choices? And then figure out where to get the best news on local incidents as they're coming up. You know, so that you can keep track of, is this something that I have an evacuation warning? What level am I in? Just staying current on those type of things.
Great. And this is kind of a broader question too, but what should Benton County citizens know about fire? And is there anything that you feel like is commonly misunderstood in terms of individuals that live in Benton County about fire?
So fire is very aggressive and very unpredictable thing in certain conditions. And the same fire will burn very differently on the day, the weather, the humidity, and those type of things. So when you see extreme fire danger, when you see the smoky sign outside of Smokey the Bear fire pointing to extreme, it means all the conditions are right. And at that point, we are not stopping the fire. We're doing the best that we can to direct it, maybe in a different direction, move people out of the way. But until the conditions change, when they're in those extreme conditions, the fire has the upper hand, and we are going to have to, it's not like we can just keep sending more resources and put it out. We have to wait for conditions to change to where we can make an effective offensive attack to surround it.
Great, thank you. I think Steve also had a few questions for you, so I'm going to pass it to him now.
All right, thanks, Jay.
Thank you, Jada. So, Chief McCarthy, question one is, what's the budget of the department? What is fire protection costing us? And then, as developments get built, is there adequate funding going along with that in the SDC fees that are charged?
So you asked kind of two questions in one. You asked, what is the department's budget and what is fire serving costing us? So I'm going to answer that in two parts. The fire department budget with all of our funds collected is about $15.8 million for the city of Corvallis. But that is way more than just fighting fire. We have the entire ambulance contract for the county. We're responsible for all the hazardous materials spills and those type swiftwater rescue, confined space rescue. So it's just not us responding to fires, but there's a myriad of type of things we do respond to and have to be trained and have the equipment for. I will say a big difference from just a couple of years ago to recent is the police and fire utility fee, which funds a portion of that budget, allowed us to go from 12 to 16 firefighters on duty every day. So we were able to put 2 dedicated ambulances in service, thus keeping the engines from having to shut down to become ambulances. So when the Timber Hill fire happened a few years ago and only 1 engine was in service at that time because others were on the ambulance call, we'd have 3 in service today for that same fire and same conditions.
Okay, and then the other question was, as far as new building goes, I know that there's lots that are up for sale outside in rural Benton County. When these things get sold, it's maybe a 2-acre lot. Somebody builds a 3,000 square foot house on it, whatever they're doing. And there's some SDCs that go with that, yeah?
Yeah, so there's several things. So when you're in the core city area, there's insurance ratings, ISO ratings, and your homeowner insurance and such will be lower, the lower your ISO rating is. When you're the city of Corvallis has a rating of 2. We're one of 36 cities in Oregon that has that. No one has a 1. We're trying to be the first to get it down to that. But as you go out into the rural districts and you get into an area of 10, which is the highest rating, means you're more than 5 miles away from a staffed fire station, you don't have an established water supply, your threat gets bigger, and your fire rates are going to be more, and something you should check on with, when you're thinking about buying those areas. You can never build a system equivalent to a core group of citizens in a confined area as well out in the rural area, because the tax base and such there just doesn't support it. So you do get a little bit less coverage the further away and the more rural that you get, and become more self-reliant.
I think one of the things questioner is driving at is, to some extent, when a new development gets built, are the fees that get charged to the developer adequate together with the ongoing property tax base to really cover the fire cost associated with that development, generally speaking?
Sure. So depends. If you build 10 houses out in the middle of nowhere, there wouldn't be enough money that you could charge the builder to build them to give you the same type of protection. So the point is, where that development is built, the fees and such are charged equivalently to provide equal coverage for the norm of that area, but that area will dictate what the norm is. So it's hard for me to say, yes, it's adequate coverage, because that's kind of a personal choice as to what level of coverage and comfort do you have.
Okay, good. And then next question is there anything in terms of state or federal law that you feel could be in place would be helpful in terms of public safety from your standpoint as fire chief?
Certainly. The best firefighter in the world for almost any type of fire, other than wildland fire, is not a firefighter. It's sprinklers. There's a huge expense to that. It raises your housing costs. It raises a lot of other things, but sprinklers are on scene when the fire starts, something that's pretty expensive to buy a firefighter to stand at everybody's house, just in case that happens. So I would love to see federal law come to putting sprinklers in all new construction, whether it's residential or commercial. But that's going to be a big fight with some people opposed to the cost of it.
Okay, great. Okay, and then I guess lastly, I think this has really been to some extent covered, but if you're talking about urban planning, as we bump into the forest, do you think that the city is at this point in the county doing an adequate job of planning for egress and such?
So I think that there's a cost to building out into certain areas. The city does a good job of planning. There are codes. I'm not the planning and development department head, so I can't really speak really clearly on that. I do know that we are working with the Emergency Office of Services, emergency planning for neighborhoods that are kind of isolated, to try to look at other ways of making egress. I think it's the one on Dry Creek is looking at a cooperative deal with OSU through your sheep farm to make another access and egress from that development. So there is ongoing, but the code is always followed. There would never be a development that would be subcode. It's up to citizens to pick or to increase above that. And that's something I would say should be, when you're thinking about your new lawn and all the new things you want to buy for your nice new house, getting together with your neighbors and looking at what is the fire safety, what is our plan here, getting together in neighborhood associations and saying, if we build a bridge right here, we can connect to that backside to that road over there, and that gives us more options. So there is a responsibility for the city and the county, but there's also a responsibility for homeowners and neighborhood associations.
Okay, and then total employees for the department?
So there's 80 paid and 25 volunteers for Corvallis Fire, and that also includes one station in the Corvallis Rural District, which is on Lewisburg, which contracts with us. So that's actually a separate department, but they contract with us to provide the administrative services.
Okay, great. And then you come from San Jose, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then what are some of the differences and similarities between the situation here and the situation there, and how's that kind of instructed your approach?
Probably the biggest one that I didn't really think about, I researched Corvallis greatly. I didn't really research Benton County. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Bay Area. I can keep calling resources all day, and they're going to keep coming because there's cities all around us. But here, we are the big player in this county, and there's not a lot of other help coming locally. I mean, really good people. We just don't have the numbers and the population. So if you get something big, you need to go up to the state level, maybe federal level really quick, and recognize that versus relying on local resources to be able to handle everything. So that's probably the biggest change in my mindset that I've had to wrap around, is that strategic part of the limited resources that we have.
Jada, I'll turn it back to you. And then if failing that you have any follow-up with Ken, he may actually get a break before the Rural Fires meeting.
Thanks, Steve. I don't have a follow-up unless there's anything else that you want to add, Ken.
All I will say is two things. We are always looking to have the interaction with the public and preparation for whether it's wildland fires or earthquake emergencies. Dave Busby is my civilian emergency operation planner. He does neighborhood association evacuation drills and many other things. That's one way to reach out. I also do an hour presentation on the history of the American Fire Service, the current condition, Corvallis specific challenges going forward. And I'm always looking for groups that might want to have that presentation. So feel free to reach out to the fire department. I'd really appreciate that opportunity to get out there and meet more of the citizens and have more of this type of dialogue. So thank you for the opportunity tonight.
Wondering if Professor Bailey or Professor Lavelle have any questions for Chief McCarthy.
Sure. I was going to ask whether or not you recommend the firewise.org, and do you send Corvallis residents to that website and those resources for the Firewise stuff?
Yeah, Firewise has great information on it. That's one of many resources out there. But yeah, I definitely would recommend people take a time and look at that one and support it and think it's a great resource.
Yeah. And I liked your point about the neighbors, working with your neighbors, because neighborhoods often stand or fall together, right, as a unit. So that kind of communication and joint work is important.
Great.
Chief, I just want to say to you and your folks, thanks for the service to the community. Appreciate it.
It's our pleasure. It's been a great career change for me. My commute went from 2.5 hours to 8 minutes. So I'm loving it here. So
great. Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to answer our questions as well. We appreciate it.
You bet. You have a great night.
As always, Ken, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Have a great evening.
You too. Thanks. Bye.
Jada.
All right. We're now going to move to John Bailey. John, thanks for being here as well. First, this is a pretty broad question, but how have Oregon's wildfires changed in recent years?
Well, we've seen an increase in the acreage, and particularly the acreage of large fires. In this summer will be a new record, and to my knowledge, across a number of statistics, our three big years are all in the last 4 years. We had the year off last year, but whether or not you're looking at the acreage or the dollars spent or the staff time that has gone to it, And remember, even beyond the suppression costs, you have to multiply that out tenfold or so in terms of getting estimates for the damage that is done. So regardless of what the statistics that you look at, we've entered a new reality, and we've been on that course for a good couple decades now in my career, as we've been watching and talking about that. Really driven by three things. One is just a warmer climate, longer fire season, drier fuels, those kinds of things. Maybe a little bit of indication that it's even windier, but the clearest signal is that it's just warmer and the fire seasons are longer. Then we have just fuel accumulation out there. As I tell my students, the trees are growing every day, every week, every month, and they're producing this fuel. They're taking sunshine and carbon dioxide and making carbohydrate, which is also known as fuel. And so that is accumulating, and there are a couple ways that it leaves our hillsides. One is the kind of management activities, but a big one, and certainly going back thousands of years, the major one has been through burning, not through decomposition or usage. But our Native American ancestors did a lot of burning, and that's how they limited fuels on the landscape. So we've got the climate signal, we've got the fuels signal, and then finally we just have more humans out there. And so that's created the collision course and created this new reality that we have.
Great, thank you. And I know that in some parts of Oregon, fire is a natural part of the landscape. So can you kind of differentiate between what could be considered like a good fire and a bad fire? And maybe also, how does fire impact forest health throughout the state?
Yeah, and I play around with the words good fire and bad fire, but we have to acknowledge that it just kind of is this thing, and it is this spectrum, and every fire event, much less a large fire, has all those kind of components in it. It is definitely part of the ecology and the evolutionary history of most of the vegetation types that we have in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. And so things like the grasslands, the oak savannas, and to a certain extent, even the ponderosa pine savannas and woodlands of the past, and there's still some examples out on the landscape, they burn several times every decade, whether that's through natural ignitions or through the indigenous burning practices. And that's really how those lands were managed. And again, for millennia. Anywhere where there's Douglas fir and sugar pine, so down in the Siskiyou-Klamath kind of area, the Douglas fir on either side of the Willamette Valley and other locations. If you have Douglas fir, that's typically areas that burned a couple times every century. And then we have a few veg types and conditions at high elevations or right along the coast that only burned once every couple hundred years. And so that's kind of the western hemlock, Sitka spruce, the high elevation true fir, mountain hemlock, kinds of communities. They don't often see fire, but about half the state is forested, and 90-some% has that kind of fire history and fire ecology. And of course, the rangelands and grasslands make up the other half of the state, and the vast majority of those acres have a fire history and a fire ecology associated with them.
Great, thank you. And you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about prescribed burning, but in terms of forest and fire management, what actions or steps do you feel like could and should be taken in the state of Oregon?
We're not allowed to make specific policy recommendations, but what I encourage people to remember is that our forests are just amazing. Actually, all our ecosystems in Oregon are amazing, but I'm biased. I'm a forester. I focus in on those forests. And the forests are amazing for what they give us in terms of wood and fiber or carbon, or depending on in the jobs and the economy and all that kind of stuff. And that's important. We have to acknowledge that. But also the wildlife, the wildlife that is endangered, the wildlife that's very charismatic, but also all of the life forms out there are integrally tied to these ecosystems. And so it's important for wildlife habitat. It's important because of the watersheds and the connection to aquatic systems, but also our municipal drinking supply. Like 80% of our fresh water, drinking water in the state is coming from forested landscapes. It's all the recreational opportunities. It's the spiritual value. It's the scenery. The forest is all those things. It's all those things at once. And it's also fuel. And we we've gone through a phase where we kind of forgot about that fuel side of it, the fire history and the fuel side. And so my recommendation always is remember the fuel. Remember that it is fuel, that it's going to burn. We're coming out of a phase where the burns were seen as unique events that may or may not happen during your career, your lifetime, and all that kind of stuff. And if you got a big fire, it was a career shaping event. And Daniel can probably talk about that as well. That, early in our careers, that was, this big 10,000 acre fire is gonna shape your career. It's like, we're lucky to keep them at 10,000 now, and we're having annual 100,000 acre fires. So that we've forgotten that it's fuel. We got to remember that it's fuel and that it's going to burn.
Perfect. Thanks, John. We're going to move on to Daniel now, but Steve will ask you a few more questions after Daniel. But Daniel, thank you for being here as well. First, can you kind of describe your experience in OSU's fire extension program and how you're currently involved, and just generally like what the extension program is?
Sure. Carrie Berger, the fire program manager, and I have worked towards building a fire program at the College of Forestry extension for it's been about 5 years. And we put together some educational materials, fire science core curriculum 5 years ago, and published it, and wanted to develop, we saw a need for a fire program and extension within our extension infrastructure across the state. And we started building it and made a pitch we didn't make a pitch. We informed the state legislature about it, and they were gracious enough to grant funding for it. And this past June, it was funded to provide 8 new positions, a state fire specialist position, which I hold, fire program manager that Carrie holds, and 6 regional fire specialists to go out into the community, profess into the communities from the College of Forestry, and teach fire science, teach fire prevention, fire maintenance, and do risk assessments and work with partners and work on landscape efforts that mitigate risk. And it legislature really wants this to happen, and they have funded us and want us to make a difference on the ground in reducing the risk to fire for our communities. It's a really good opportunity.
Yeah, and kind of to go off that, maybe what do you feel is unique about OSU's fire extension program, and also what are some of the long-term goals and objectives of the program?
So I don't know of another program like it anywhere in the country, at any college or university. It's that unique, and it's tailored to not only provide education and outreach across the state, but the state of Oregon Forestry and Natural Resource Extension Program is unique to begin with, and it has been. I don't know of another extension program that has the agents on the ground, the specialists available across the state in forestry and natural resources. So our fire program works within that infrastructure to go out into the communities, and that's a really unique thing. And these are professors of practice. They're faculty members within the College of Forestry, and they're available to the communities. They live out in the communities, and they will try to tackle some of the issues we're dealing with in fire. So the goals are to change the culture of fire awareness by teaching fire benefits, fire, the negative aspects, the positive aspects, teach about fire, the hazard, to across the state in as many venues and audiences as we can take, from kindergarten to senior citizen. We want to teach about the hazard of fire. Any hazard has a positive or negative to it, depending on how it's used and how it behaves. We want to teach about the values at risk across the state to that hazard. We want to help the communities prepare for that hazard to their values. We want to assist our valued agency and entity partners across the state, be it the Nature Conservancy, Oregon Department of Forestry, Forest Service, Watershed Council, Soil Water Conservation Districts, National Resource Conservation. The list is long. We want to partner up. We want to assist these partnerships. We want to bring about landscape, cross-boundary, public-private efforts at assessing the risk and mitigating the risk consistent with forest health and wildlife habitat, and try to make these communities safer. That's the ultimate goal. The ultimate success of our program will be that if a fire does occur in one of our communities, or land ownerships, forest range, or agriculture, that the impact would have been lessened. We may never stop fire, but our program has a goal of mitigating the risk, lessening the risk, therefore lessening the probability of harm to values and lessening the consequences or the impact of that harm. That's the ultimate goal.
Perfect, thank you. This is a question too, just kind of about your experience. I know you have experience as a firefighter, so I was curious if that kind of impacted the work you do today in the extension program, but also if fires have changed since you were on the ground fighting fires.
Yes and yes. Well, I started with fire in 1969 in the military, and in 1973, I started with the Fire Control Laboratory in Riverside, California. Since that time, well, since 69, I've been involved with fire in some way or another in different areas across the country. I was on incident management teams for a number of years, actively wildland firefighting for over 30 years, and working my way up the ladder, was in control of the fires as an ops chief and incident commander for about 15 years. And then I was a structure firefighter and structure fire chief in a rural fire district in Northwest Montana for 6 years. Then I volunteered as a firefighter EMT in other fire departments for about 4 years. So does that color my attitude in this job? I mean, you betcha. I mean, you bet it does. And what that experience embedded in my bones drives my attitude towards the program, and my gratitude in having the opportunity to participate in a program like this, because I've seen what happens when forests aren't managed, when homes are not, home defense is not enacted, when, you know, I can go into a home and I can see the potential for a fire where there should be smoke alarms, where there should be fire extinguishers, because I've been in burning homes before. So when we go into this extension program and we do a risk assessment to a home, well, I know the effects of not doing anything to prevent that, to prevent the hazard to that home. I know how homes burn. I know how forests burn. I know how the two burn together. And I've seen the change from 1973 to now to 2020. Yes, definitely. Not only has the population of the country increased by 130 million people in that time period, but the number of households has increased, has doubled, but seasons are drier. Red flag days are more numerous. The fire season starts earlier and it ends later. In just that time period of that 50-year period, I've seen the change where fires are harder to put out. Where we have, like John said, where in the early 70s, a 10,000 acre fire was significant. And in the 80s, a 100,000 acre fire was significant. In the 90s, a 200,000 acre fire was significant. In the 2000s, and now we're looking at 1 million acres is significant. Most definitely. From 2014 to 2020, those 7 years are the hottest years in the 140 years of taking weather records. And 2020 is shaping up to be the hottest of the hottest. So with that, in 2014, you started having fires, the 36 pit fire out of Estacada. Well, and then you had the Eagle Creek fire, and now you have these West Side fires. The last time the west side of Oregon burned to this extent was in the 1880s in the Silverton fire. Not since then. But now, my experience tells me it's not a once in a lifetime event, that it's shaping up to be a more common. What's happening in California with the Paradise Fire, the Malibu, and those fires is now coming up to Southern Oregon. So yeah, it's changing. It's changing.
Great, thank you for that. And this, I also posed this question to John, but in terms of fire and forest management, what kind of actions or steps do you feel should and could be taken in the state of Oregon?
Daniel, you want me to start on that?
Oh, sure, John, if you want.
Okay, good. So, because I can pick up right from that idea of treating the fuels, and we don't have a lot of chemical tools for altering the fuel matrix out there, but we certainly have a whole host of mechanical tools, some commercial and some non-commercial, some involving equipment, some being done by hand, but some kind of mechanical removal and or treatment and alteration of the fuel in order for the fire behavior to be more in line with what we would, with what would give us more of the outcomes that we would like to have. But one of the cheaper and more ecological tools is fire itself. And that's kind of how it makes up this kind of this spectrum that, not only is it this hazard and can be dangerous, but it's also a very nice tool that can be used to lessen the risk in the future. And so that's why we talk about prescribed fire as a management tool to reduce the fuels on the landscape.
And I want to add something to what John said. And sure, fuels is one side of the triangle we can have an effect on. The weather, the topography, we can't do much about, but the fuels we can. Given that, what I would recommend for the state of Oregon, and it's being done in some places, would be an assessment. That's what I recommend for structures. That's what I recommend for landscapes. That's what I recommend first, is to assess where the need exists, where the priorities are. Instead of a blanket, well, let's thin 30 million acres, what I would do, what I would recommend is, based on sound science, do an assessment. Do an assessment within a structure, do an assessment around a structure, do an assessment on the landscape, be that forest part where the intersection is and assess where the risks are the greatest, where that hazard meets the value at risk, where the probability of that risk doing the greatest harm exists in the greatest area. With our limited resources, get the biggest bang for the buck we invest. I said for decades, if we could take $1 and put it up front to do the assessments and the mitigation and the implementation of projects, for every million I have spent during and post incidents, we would be much better off. So I would start with the assessment first, see where the need is the greatest, meeting the objectives of not only fire mitigation, but forest health, wildlife habitat, and other objectives, and then proceed forward.
Great, thank you. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to turn to Steve now with some audience questions. Steve?
Great, and the first one, I think this, I don't know if this has really been addressed, but this person is asking straightforwardly, okay, gentlemen, yes or no, and to what extent, climate change, is that the major driver behind the growth of forest fire? I will start with you, John.
Okay. In some areas, it would, and in some ecosystems, yes, it is the major driver, and the fuel situation just isn't that different. And so the increase in intensity and severity that we see, it has to be pegged to either the warmer, temperatures and the longer fire seasons and the ability to respond, or the values that get impacted by that. But yeah, I am comfortable saying it's climate for those situations. But there are plenty of times and examples that we can hold up where it's the fuel side of the fire behavior triangle that really has driven the intensity and the severity being inconsistent with what we would see. So we can play the blame game, and we can talk about the climate signal or the fuel signal or the humans doing what humans have done. But which one is the most, they're all important everywhere. And which one is most important, can vary from one situation to the next. But those analyses have been done.
Okay, and then, I'll kind of follow up briefly, and then I'm going to move over to Daniel. Out of the fires we've had in Oregon this year thus far, where's the major driver for causality been? Climate change, arson, human negligence, lightning, right?
Right. And we're still doing the diagnostics for the fires that were this year in terms of what even the ignition source was, and was it a barbecue that turned over at a mobile home park, or was it the power line sparking, or was it trees across power line, all that kind of stuff. So that information is yet to come out. But I do hold as an example the Holiday Farm fire and those kinds of things as an example where the fuel. So those were forested, forest fires in heavily fuel laden, forested ecosystems, and so the fuel signal is going to be in that analysis. But that's very different than, I'm drawing a blank on the fire name, but the one down at Talent in Phoenix, which was out in the valley floor. That fuel wasn't a strong signal of what we blame there. It was a high wind event and a poorly timed ignition. I think they have a sense of the location, but not the cause yet. And it was a wind-driven fire up that ignites a couple of the houses on the right at the Wildland Urban interface. And thereafter, it was just a house-to-house fire and very rapid. So,
right.
So there it's humans and wind, but we get wind all the time. So can we really blame climate for just a high wind event? So, again, there all three come into play every time, and we just kind of have to parse out individually what had happened.
Okay, and then Daniel, I'm going to move to you. Climate change as causation, yes, no, to what extent?
So the Beachy Creek fire is an example where we, prior to Labor Day, we had on the west side of Oregon hot temperatures, humidities down to about 20% on average for a long time. That seasoned out a lot of the fuels, drying out fuels. There were fires, lightning strikes up on top of the Cascades, and then that east wind blew 60, 80 mile per hour up over the ridge, caught the fires in the Cascades, and blew this living river of fire and heat, single digit humidities behind that at night. And it blew it down low into the valleys, into the ravines, blasting out ahead, wind driven. But the curing of the fuel, including homes and trees, occurred long before that. So yes, temperatures are hotter, drier, longer, but the west side of Oregon has a history of higher precipitation. So the biomass is greater, moss on the trees are thicker, and now you dry that entire area out, and then you put single digit humidity, put a spark to that with 60 to 80 mile per hour wind, anything will burn. And the same thing down south. You know, the homes burn 10 times faster, 8 times hotter than they did when I started in the early 70s because of new construction materials, because of synthetics, because of laminates, because of glues. 10 times hotter, 8 times faster. Homes are built closer together. My sister moved into a subdivision outside of Medford last year. The homes are 6 feet apart. I'm exaggerating, but they're really close. Right heat, wind, humidity conditions, red flag conditions, fires start, fires burn, fuel carries it.
So and I'm going to stop you for a minute, and I'll let you continue in a minute, but I just want to touch on something. Did you say some of the materials being used in the construction of newer homes are themselves creating a faster burning fire once fire takes hold of a home?
So Steve, 30 years ago, when we responded to a house fire, and if the house were made of organic material, wools, cottons, real wood, we had rule of thumb 30 minutes, but when the alarm sounded, we got into our gear, we had 30 minutes to go to the structure, had time to make entry, make rescue, put the fire out. Now, with modern materials of laminates and glues and synthetics, we have 3 minutes before a condition called a flashover occurs in the house that burns the house down. 3 minutes. We can't leave the station and get to the house in that amount of time.
Has there been any examination of that in public policy?
We don't know how, we know Chief can validate this, but fire engineer, we know the engineering behind fire behavior in a structure. We know how a fire behaves outside of a structure, immediately outside of a structure. We do not know how fires behave in aggregations of closely packed, highly flammable boxes of fuel. We do not know the fire behavior science in subdivisions to know what to do about it.
But I'm just asking, in terms of individuated homes, if we know the materials we're putting into them more quickly burn, is this something that you would hope that regulation might address or no?
Yeah, you would hope so. And that's why I agree with the chief. If we had sprinkler systems in these homes that burn 10 times faster, we would be much better off.
Is anybody proposing anything? And then what's the cost of a sprinkler system like that? Versus using what I'm assuming are materials being used because they are less expensive.
Mass produce, less expensive. Yeah. And that's, we don't know enough about what to do about it. We don't know enough about the science behind it to make recommendations on what to do about it.
And
okay,
Steve,
and then
there's an interesting parallel there to kind of what our mindset is as a society and as individuals is. We see the fires out in the wildlands and in the forest as a rare. I mean, we've grown up and portrayed it as a rare thing, a rare singular incident, and the same idea that your house may catch on fire. And so we've gotten away from the thought of, well, if we have a fire in here in the living room, what are we going to do? Where's the fire extinguisher? What are all these materials that we have? We've just gotten away from that because we've made it a very isolated and rare construct in our minds. And just, what we're learning is that's not the case. It's,
well, that's why
fire's going to be a common thing.
And that's why we're recommending strongly that we look at fire as a hazard within the home, surrounding the home, across the landscape, public, private. To really make an impact, we need to look at each level of scale collectively, because the web of change that's occurred is exacerbating that hazard, increasing the risk. And management of fuel is part of that equation. And we can do something about that. We can do something about reducing fuel in the home. We can do something about smoke detectors or fire extinguishers, or like John said, we can teach people to look for certain things. They still need to make the choices. They still need to make the choices and do the actions required. They still need to do that. But I think it's our responsibility to teach them of not only the hazard, but the consequences of that hazard to their values at risk and how to do it. And then it's their choice whether to do it or not.
And this next question, and bearing in mind, of course, it is a political year and divisive at that. Donald Trump earlier in the year, or last year, I forget which now, blamed the fires in California on forest management. Is that a true claim in your mind? And if so, or if not, why? John, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. The element of realism in it, the only element of realism in it is that connection to fuels. And on a small scale, yes, we can break up fuels and collect it. And individual homeowner, I recommend it for individual homeowners that have a yard or a small property or that kind of thing. But that just can't be scaled up to tens of millions of acres on steep slopes, forest conditions rather than a yard, and all those kinds of things. So yes, there is the issue of fuels, but raking the forest is not the answer.
And Dan, I'm going to move over to you.
It's got to be a comprehensive approach based on sound science. And that means doing a complete assessment over a landscape, see where the priorities are, and understanding the intricacies of that web of change creating an exacerbated hazard and what to do about it. Fuel management is one small piece of it, important piece, but there's so much more that you need to approach this with.
Okay, and then, I guess connected with all of this discussion, what are the costs socially for fire? What are we spending? I guess what are we spending in terms of the cost of fire seasons? And maybe, are there other related social costs that we don't think about in terms of these fires? Dan, who'd like to start?
Well, I can start. Billions of dollars. What did Paradise cost? Was it $12 billion? And the smoke that's produced at that time of the year, the events, the impact on health and civic events and businesses, the cost of if I had $1 to put up front for every billion I've spent during and after, we would be much better off. But the cost is just skyrocketing.
Yeah, that actually brings up the next question, and then I'm going to move over to John with both of these. What are the if we continue to have smoke events like what we've had, or even a little bit lesser, and the air quality was awful for days, if this is going to continue or worsen, what are the long-term health effects and impacts for citizens here in Corvallis? Dan, I'll start with you, and then John, I'm going to move to you about cost and health.
Well, I breathed in smoke for almost 40 years, and house smoke and forest smoke and sure, my lungs are damaged and heat scarred and all the rest. And I know the cost of long-term smoke impacts on health too well, I think. And I just think it could be offset, but the cost is high.
Okay, John, I'm going to move over to you. Economic impact in terms of the cost of the fires, and then the associated cost first, and then the health impacts of long-term smoke inhalation with more forest fires to the average citizen.
Yeah, and I can just base this on what I've read and what comes across my view as I participate in national and international conferences and hear people talking about these things. And people that are really interested can go to the National Interagency Fire Center and look at suppression cost by states and by agencies and all that kind of thing. But cumulatively, we've been up in the $4 billion a year, and I'm sure this year we'll set a new record above that. That's going to the actual suppression. That's the checkbook that's open for all of the people in the helicopters and the airplanes and all that kind of stuff. And that's a remarkable number relative to the beginning of Daniel and I's careers. Although it's interesting, I'm wondering if I was just a grunt firefighter one time when Daniel was my incident commander, but we'll have to compare notes to figure that out. But it's a big number. And then the estimates that the health impacts, I saw a paper recently that talked about it's probably 4 to 10 times the cost of the suppression dollars that go into it. And then the insurance industry is talking about 10 to 100 times the suppression expenses is the cost to just the human values, the homes and infrastructures and the insurance claims and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't even count the millions or billions of dollars of natural resources loss. Whether it's the carbon markets or the timber or the millions of dollars that Denver spends each year now in additional water treatment cost because a big chunk of their watershed burned in the Hayman fire a decade or so ago. So that, there are long-term ongoing millions and billions of dollars of cost associated with this that go well beyond these rapidly expanding suppression costs.
Okay, and then, I guess, maybe this has already been a bit covered, I don't know, but questioners asking this, what about logging and thinning as a potential solution? In other words, harvest.
Yeah, as Daniel was saying, and the forest management part and the fuels management part is part of it, and needs to be factored in there strategically, and can be integrated, particularly across different landowners. Some landowner classes is that's a major objective to what they do is removing commercial timber that can be folded into our landscape level vision for how to manipulate and manage fuels on our landscape. But individual landowners can think about it. Some can yield a lot of money and pay the shareholders of the companies off. Some can yield a little bit of money. Some's going to cost a little bit of money. Some could cost a lot of money, and you're going to need some kind of grant to do it. But we don't just print that money. That money has to come from somewhere as well. But the key is to remember the fuels part of it, and think about what is across the different owners and their missions. How can they come to the table and participate in this?
And then I guess as a follow-up to that, what about on public lands? Same thing. I mean, could there be a permit process, and would that help to ameliorate some of the circumstance here?
Yes, so we have those kinds of timber sale programs, stewardship contracting, in fuel wood sales, restoration work, the collaborative forest landscape projects. We have many things already in place that could be exercised more than we're currently using them. And we've been talking about increasing the pace and scale of those kinds of treatments for a long time.
Working through the questioner's question, do you feel enough is being done, or could more be done in terms of these kinds of timber sales?
Certainly more can be done, and we continue to talk about increasing the pace and scale of our land management practices, and particularly prescribed fire. It's a relatively inexpensive treatment for treating the fine surface fuels, the really small fuels that are very reactive, both to the environment, but also to the flaming front as it comes through. So it's a major predictor of fire behavior, and prescribed burning is a wonderful tool for treating those small materials that are otherwise very expensive to deal with.
Daniel, I'll move to you on the subject in terms of logging and thinning and such.
So before I took the job here on campus in last year, I was in Klamath Lake County for 5 or 6 years, and I worked with a really good partnership, the Klamath Lake Forest Health Partnership, and we did that. So what we did, within 4 years, we had assessed, mapped, and managed 3 large landscapes of public-private Fremont-Wainema National Forest private land ownership. And our first landscape was about 150,000 acres. And the second one was a little bit bigger, and the third one was bigger than that. Within 4 years, had thousands of acres under management based on sound science, based on an assessment of risk, and strategically placed, consistent with all other values on public and private land goals and objectives, meeting risk reduction, meeting wildlife habitat, meeting watershed quality objectives. But what it took were agreements, were breaking barriers between agencies and entities and private and public, and coming to the same table, creating a partnership that worked together, whose main objective was to get work done on the ground to meet these objectives, rather than saying no. We ultimately came to a conclusion that yes, we could, and they did. And it's working as we speak, and it will work into the future as well. Within another 2 or 3 years, they're looking at over 1 million acres of sound science, consistent cross-boundary management that really works. That's what we need to do. It starts with a partnership. It has to go to the agreements. It has to be cross-boundary, public-private, and it can be done.
And somewhat dovetailed with this last series of questions, what could either the state or the federal government be doing more or less of that might assist in managing and preventing these fires? Who'd
Look,
like to start?
one of the biggest things we would recommend is that all entities, county, state, federal, would make these landscape partnership cross-boundary public-private efforts the program of work, not to be competed for in addition to what they're doing, but to be what they're doing. So that our tax money that's funding the work of these organizations will be spent doing these landscape efforts, these partnership efforts, and focus on that, assist that, bring the private landowners along, do the education outreach and project implementation, and make a difference on the ground. I think that's the only way we can get to that increased scope and scale that we've been talking about.
And it's interesting when it's on fire and we're doing one of these incident responses, all these different groups are very good at collaborating, and we do it even at 2 o'clock in the morning.
That's a good point.
We haven't slept for a while, but that's because we're on the same mission.
Yeah.
At that point. And it's amazing what we do as humans. It's kind of reminiscent of the Greatest Generation, pulling together and all that kind of stuff. It's a glorious moment. But by golly, we cannot do it at 10 o'clock in the morning over a box of donuts when we're trying to plan this stuff in advance. And because we have our own competing interest and all this stuff. So I think we really need to go back to our hearts and say, we are on the same mission here to conserve the land for our children and our grandchildren. We have got to be able to work through this and do this kind of collaborative work that Daniel's talking about. We can do it, and we have a responsibility to do it.
And John, it's really interesting. Jada asked me, how does my experience color what I'm doing now? Those landscape efforts in South Central Oregon were put together as an incident would be put together to do exactly that. Collaborative management, just like we would do a unified command on an incident. And the partners rallied to that. And we did conduct those landscape efforts as we would an incident management response. And it worked.
When you're on the same mission, you can make it happen. And it's not that every acre is going to make everybody happy, but overall, if you're on the same mission, we can make it happen and do a lot more than we're currently doing.
And that's the proof of concept. It works.
Great. I don't know where Steve
somewhere in there.
I just ask another question, I guess. These are his questions, but I can go through and ask another one. I guess I'm curious. I know that Extension works on this a lot, and maybe Daniel's touched on this a bit too, but what is the importance of making sure that Oregonians are educated? Sorry, Steve's calling me. Hold on. I'm going to ask the question. Hold on, I'm asking a question. What I was going to say is, what's the importance of educating Oregonians? But also, maybe what are some of the most common misconceptions that you think Oregonians have regarding fire in Oregon?
Well, for Extension, that's why Extension was created, over 114 years ago, was to do exactly that, was to profess, if you will, out into the communities and to the landowners and the citizens. That's why Extension was created. It still has that mission. Its mission is to reach out into the communities, being the conduit of the university, of the college, the conduit out into the community to make a difference, to have an impact on communities, economies, and ecosystems. That's the mission of the College of Forestry Extension. And we've got my colleagues there and in the College of Forestry, they all take that very seriously, and they're doing that. So yes, education in my mind is critical. We can do anything else, but we need to educate. We need to educate to the point of actually altering the culture of the attitude to fire. If I were to ask most groups we do workshops with, I like to ask, well, what gut reaction? What's your first gut reaction when I say the word fire? Well, obviously the majority is fear. They're afraid. And there's reason for that. But so that's where the education comes in. We really desperately need to do that first.
Steve's back. Steve, do you have any other questions that you wanted to ask?
Speaking of unforeseen circumstance, had a quick power outage over here. Did we get? Did all the other questions really, in fact, get asked? And there's the one for me, which is kind of that last thing of what are the misconceptions out there, and what are they, and clearing them up.
Yeah. I'd like to take on that issue of prescribed fire and the misconceptions around the amount of risk there, and what the problem has been with trying to burn acres under prescription. So I want the listeners to know that less than 2% of prescribed fires escape, and only a handful of those ever become significant. There's just a little bit of slop over. When they do, it's big news, but it's just not that common of an event. And the smoke from prescribed burning, because we choose the conditions of the fuel and the weather conditions, we really can regulate where the bulk of the smoke is traveling. And the nature of the smoke itself is also different because we're getting more complete combustion. We're burning fuels that are ready to burn, unlike during the wildfires when everything is attempting to be burned. So you could even look at the color of the smoke of a prescribed fire versus a wildfire, and see that the quality of the smoke is really different. So when we had those 10 days in Corvallis that we were completely smoked out, that was a nasty mix of unburned stuff and stuff that should not have been burned and should not be in the air, that would never get in the air with prescribed fire. And so, it's just that the quantity and the quality of the smoke is very different. And so, I'd like to correct some of those misconceptions, such that when I put a little bit of smoke in the air from McDonald Forest or the Dunn Forest, or working with my ODF colleagues or Forest Service colleagues, and you smell a little bit of smoke in the air one morning or one afternoon here in Corvallis, that rather than writing a nasty letter to me, or feeling afraid and calling 911, calling the chief, that the first reaction is actually, oh, good, someone is managing the hazard out there, and the risk to Corvallis is being mitigated, by those management activities. And a little bit of nuisance from the smoke, but a very different beast from wildfire smoke.
Okay, and Daniel, I'll move to you. Common misconceptions and kind of answers to those misconceptions.
Yeah, I think I agree with John on the misconception to the benefits of prescribed burning. I agree with what he said there. And I have another misconception that I've commonly seen, especially on the west side of the state, not the southwest, but especially the northwest side of the state, is that, oh, we won't burn. We can't burn. West side forests don't burn. I heard that for so many years. Or subdivisions won't burn. And people don't take they don't take the potential of burning seriously, and they don't take the beneficial burning seriously. So it's the two. We can use fire for our benefit, and that to me takes education. And we're working on that. We're actually building our fire program is building a prescribed fire program, training curriculum, if you will, consistent with Oregon Department of Forestry and the Forest Service and all the partners, and our first pilot project is next spring. So we are actually building the curriculum to take out into the communities with the partners to teach how prescribed burning can be beneficial. The we can't burn misconception, well, I think that a lot of that dissolved this fire season. And I never ever wish calamity on anybody. I never want to see that. But I believe that once calamity happens, we need to learn from it. We need to be proactive to it so we don't repeat it. And that's what we need to do after this fire season.
So I'm going to ask really what is essentially a selfish question next. If a guy happened to be thinking about becoming a hermit in the forest somewhere and building himself a very small structure somewhere to retire in, really want to be away from people to some extent, you know, how, you know, what are some takeaways, some advice? I think that's not an uncommon dream. I'll start with you, John.
Okay. Yeah, this is not a question I often get. So thinking on the fly as I make this recommendation for you. Oh no, we're not talking about you.
I'm asking for a friend.
Definitely small. Look at your building materials. So smaller, and particularly a metal roof. Probably no gutters at all. If you don't want to be messing with getting up and cleaning out gutters and that kind of thing. Look at the topographic location. Be down in the lower part. Steeper slopes are associated with more intense fire behavior. Heavier fuels, and particularly fine surface fuels, are associated with more intense fire behavior. And so you're going to want to manipulate the fuels in the immediate vicinity of your house and your hardened little cottage that you have. The chief mentioned, some of those things, the issues around gutters and eaves that collect needles and all that kind of thing. But also, you're not going to want weeds right up to your house, particularly not underneath that beautiful wooden deck that you're going to likely put there. Don't have flammable patio furniture out there as you watch the deer come and eat everything that you're trying to plant and grow out there. You can have a tree. For a while, we didn't think you could have trees close to your house, but if you're managing those fine surface fuels, the trees are fine because even in these massive wildfires, the trees often do fine. You'll see that the house burns and scorches the tree. The tree doesn't catch on fire and burn the house. Large trees, small irrigated lawn or otherwise fuel manipulated lawn area, good topographic position.
Got it.
Sprinkler. If climate does keep getting as warmer as it's warmer, it's gonna be a risk. So think about irrigation and sprinklers.
All right. Keep it simple, I would assume, because there's a possibility you'll be replacing everything.
Exactly. Insurance.
And then Dan, I would anything to add to that before I get to final question for each of you?
Oh, just use organic materials in the house and just follow the precautions. Just be aware of the wind direction during the fire season, where the fire could come from, and build accordingly. Build with the site and make sure you have enough home defense space around. Make sure you have your smoke detectors, fire extinguishers in. If you can get a gravity fed water supply, if you're off the grid, if you can get, or solar, I would put sprinkler in and around, but just make sure you know where that fire is going to come from and how hot it's going to be, and plan your site accordingly.
And I'm assuming how I'm going to get out of there if need be.
Ingress and egress. Yeah.
Right.
We call it LCES, Lookout, Communication, Escape Route, and Safety Zone. So
and I'm assuming the more escape routes, the better.
Yes.
The more escape routes, the better, and have a safety zone, and you should be okay.
And then you seem to have froze for a moment. So I will, hopefully you're hearing me. And I'll start with John. As to in terms of what is the College of Forestry up to in terms of research and training for folks? What are they up to? And I'm going to be moving then after that to Dan in terms of what's happening with extension along those lines. John.
OSU and our fire folks, we've been part of the movement over the last 2 or 3 decades to produce a lot of research on the fire history, fire ecology, and the smaller scale prescribed burning effects, fuels treatments, the impact of thinning and prescribed burning, and how different forest types respond, and how to do oak restoration. And some of that's been applied even on the McDonald Dunn forest and those kinds of things. That science is there. We've got good models and all that kind of stuff. So where we're really pushing the new horizons are on some of the social sciences around issues like prescribed burning, but also scaling up and modeling to landscape level wildfire spread, how much of a landscape needs to be treated in order to enhance the landscape level risk in the new reality that we have. And of course, unfortunately, a burgeoning new area of post-fire rehabilitation, restoration, watershed impacts, aquatic system impacts, and all that kind of stuff. We've got a good dozen faculty or so, half of which in the College of Forestry, but I've got great colleagues in public health, in engineering, in ag sciences, and fish and wildlife program. Great colleagues that are doing this research.
I'm going to move over to Daniel, and same question. Of course, you're at Extension. So kind of hit us with the awesome stuff that's happening at OSU.
Well, we're trying to arm the regional fire specialists to go out into the communities with the skills, knowledge, and abilities needed to profess fire, to teach fire, educate. So we're trying to set up an in-college, and I'm working with the dean and department head to set up a fire program within the college that will train for fire qualifications consistent with education, training, and experience. So the triangle of firefighting knowledge collectively consists of those 3 things. We're trying to build a fire program within the college consistent with our extension mission to train those researchers, faculty members, students to obtain fire quals and academic credit and fire credentialing. So we're working on that, and we want to bring that training. Like I said, we're working on a prescribed fire curriculum to train agency partners, private landowners, and hopefully consistent with college objectives for researchers, faculty, and students, and try to bolster because I really feel we can't go out into the public and profess about fire until we've experienced fire. And good training is a way to do that, and getting experience. So we're trying to put that together for the college via extension and carry it out into the communities.
Thank you both, and thank you to our viewers for their interest. If you're not a subscriber, please do consider going to our site and subscribing. And again, thank you so much for your time. It's almost 8 o'clock. Jada.
Yeah, I just want to second that. Thank you to our panel tonight. We appreciate you being here. Thank you to the Corvallis Advocate staff and all the work they do behind the scenes to make these CitySpeaks possible. Also, thank you to our supporters, Peak Sports and First Alternative Natural Foods Co-op. The CitySpeak is adjourned. Good night.
Thank you for the opportunity.